This is the story of Roanoa Zoro, as told by yours truly, the Green Angel. So Zoro, um, Zoro grew up on in Shimotsky Village, I think is what it was called. It was settled there by Kozaburo Shimotsky, and he took people from Wano to that place, and Zoro was born there, and he lived there. There, Zoro learned the love of sword fighting, swordsmanship, and being a samurai, or not being a samurai, but a swordsman. Um, the sword, the way of the sword was taught to him there by his master, which is Kuina's father. I forget his name, but he looks like Jin from Samurai Champ. So he taught Zoro swordsmanship a little bit. But Zoro was like, I'm gonna train even harder than everybody else in the dojo. However, Zoro was always getting beat by Kuina. Kuina was a girl who was the daughter of, his sensei. And he was like, okay, well, I'll train even harder and harder. She ended up beating him every time. She told him, she says, one day, I'm gonna, grow, basically become a woman, have a chest and other things, and I'll be expected to do what women do. I can't even be a swordsman because I'm a woman. And then he was like, don't even be like that. You're still like better than me and other things. I still have to work my ass off to like even get, to your level, you know. And then she died. She fell down the steps and died. Um, Zoro was then, upset that his friend that he was working towards, because he was trying to be better than her. And her sword was the Wando Ichimonji, given to her by her father, which was given to him by Kozaburo Shimotsuki. And he was like, here, you know, Zoro, you want this sword? And he was like, yes, my name will reach the heavens one day and I'll be the greatest swordsman in the world. Believe that. And he was like, okay, take her sword and you can do what you need to with it. And then, eventually Zoro grows up a little bit and he becomes a pirate hunter. He starts hunting pirates, and he does it so he can have money and other things. Because, that's the world of One Piece. You gotta make money somehow. And he's like, why not, be a pirate hunter a little bit. Take them in and get their bounties for some money so I can survive. Alcohol, food, all that shit that you need to survive. On this, during this time, Zoro meets two guys who are also bounty hunters, Johnny and Yosaku. Johnny and Yosaku, thought Zoro was, some, just whatever. Zoro showcases his power against some bandits that were giving them problems. And he was like, oh shit, that's Zoro of the Three Swords. That's They start calling him Big Bro Zoro. After that, they're like, oh shit, that's Big Bro Zoro. And Zoro's like, okay, guys, we can work together for a little bit. I can help you guys out with a little bit of funds, but after this, I have to get somewhere else. Because I'm looking to be the best swordsman in the world as well. I'm just doing this to get by. But eventually, he gets caught by the Marine. He's caught by the Marines. He's trying to help this little girl out who was getting bullied basically by Captain Morgan's son Helmeppo, and he wanted to help her out, so he and he just put a sword up to his neck and said, leave this little girl alone. You're being a little bitch, fucking with this little girl when you don't have to. It's not necessary. You don't need to sick dogs on her or none of that extra stuff. But then he was like, okay, you want to play games with me? He was getting all dumb. He was like, oh, my daddy's this, my daddy's that. So then he hung Zoro up on a post for 3 weeks. He said, you gotta stay there for 3 weeks, and then you can probably possibly be free. But he wasn't gonna be free. They were gonna kill his ass after those 3 weeks were up. But then during that time he was there, just wasting away, no food, no water, just stuck there, you know. And then, you know, Luffy found him and he was like, who the fuck is this boy with the fucking rubber? You know, and he's like, yo, I heard you're a swordsman, you know, I want you to be a part of my crew. Zoro was like, what? Man, you play games too much. I don't know. But then he's like, you know what? If you can get me out of here, out of these, you know, restraints and get me my swords back, you know, I'll consider being your like guy, your right hand man. And he's like, okay. And Luffy got Zoro's swords to him, and other things. Captain Morgan was gonna cut down Luffy, but Zoro was like, you know, he had 30 swords for our Onigiri and cut down Captain Morgan. Captain Morgan was kind of like he was ruling that island like a dictator. Um, he wasn't a great marine. The people actually appreciated what they did, but as they were pirates, right? Luffy and Zoro, so they were like, yo, you guys got to get the fuck out of here and other stuff. You know, you might have helped us out a little bit, but you know, you're still pirates, so we'll have to send you on your way. Kobe then stayed there, and Luffy and Zoro were on their way. So Luffy and Zoro on the sea, and then Zoro was like, you know, we gotta get more crew members and other things. You know, I'm the only guy, right? He's like, yeah, you know, we'll get more people and other things. Luffy finds a bird, grabs it, and Zoro's like, oh my gosh, I have to find this boy now. You know, he gets to the island, Orange Town, where you know Buggy the Clown is. At that point, Luffy's caught by you know Buggy and other things, and he's like, I have to save my captain now. And he's fighting against Buggy, and he's trying to cut him down, but then you know Buggy has a devil fruit called the Chop Chop fruit. He sticks a fucking knife in Zoro's back, and he like plays game. But Zoro was able to get Luffy out and free, and you know then he had to like sit down and try to recover because he was bleeding. But then Captain Buggy sticks out his guys on Zoro, and not just Zoro, but Luffy, of course. And Nami's there too. He has to fight against Kawaji, the guy who's an acrobat. He uses swords. He's like, he rides around on a unicycle and he uses a sword. Zoro is like, you know, kind of like not in the best of health, so he's like, you know, playing games a little bit. But then he's like, you know, I'm done playing and shit. I'll like, you know, cut you down. He cuts down Kawaji, and then he's like, okay, Luffy's fighting against that guy who like chops himself up or whatever, you know. And then you know they, you know, get out of there. They get out of Orange Town with Nami, which is a girl who navigates, but she's a thief. She needs money for you know certain things. Um, and then Zoro, they get to Syrup Village. Zoro's like, okay, you know, eventually we need a ship. We can't be riding this rinky-dink little rowboat. You know, we're pirates. We need a fucking real boat with the real um, Jolly Roger and all that extra stuff. You know, and Luffy's like, you know what? You make a good point. So we'll find some shit here. And they find Usopp the Liar, and he's like, okay, well, I know somebody who's wealthy and cool. That'd be Kaya, Miss Kaya. You know, that girl who, you know, is sick and other things. But Usopp shows them to where Kaya is, and Zoro follows along. And then eventually they find out that Captain Kuro was actually Clawador, and he was trying to take over her estate, Kaya's estate, and all that other stuff, and also destroy the village because he's the captain of Black Cat Pirate, and they're like, all right, well, we'll help Usopp defend his village, and then they were. Zoro was, you know, fighting against them, and you know he was like, "Yo, Luffy, you know, we're gonna fight against these guys." Luffy got hypnotized and then tried to break their boat. And then he fell asleep, and then Zoro was like, "Okay, now I have to fight these people. You know, I'm the guy now." That's the hold down, and he fought against the Mayaban brothers. After they got like hypnotized by Django, so they were even more powerful. They got psyched up. He cut down the small one easy, but then the big one was giving him problems, like giving him some fucking issues, and he was like, "Yo, these guys are like, this guy's kind of powerful. He had to use three swords to cut him down." And he did, but then you know he was like, you know, is Luffy gonna get back up to fight this guy? Because like those guys kind of like you know were playing games, and they kind of took it out of me. And then Luffy got up and fought Kuro, and then they got out of there with a ship called Mary. They invited Usopp on the ship, and Usopp gave him the idea about the Jolly Roger. The Jolly Roger became, and then they were known as the Straw Hat Pirates, but not quite yet. And I get to the Baratier, and Zoro's there, and he's like, "God damn, Luffy like came on here, and he destroyed part of the ship. Now he's working as a chore boy. We have to wait for our captain to like get shit right with these people or whatever. This is crazy and shit, but whatever. I'm the guy. I'm with him. But then something happens, something that Zoro likes. Mihawk appears, Hawkeye Mihawk, the clairvoyant. One of the seven warlords of the sea, and the strongest swordsman in the world. And Zoro's like, I need to see where I like stack up. Am I even on his level? Do I even like count? People were like, that's a three sword child Zoro, and he's going against the strongest swordsman in the world. Everybody like kind of stood back and was like, what's gonna happen between these two? Zoro was like, made a fool of basically. He couldn't do anything. But he was like, scars on the back is a swordsman of shame. Cut me right here on my chest. And then Miyako was like, okay, whatever you want. And then Miyako was like, find me when you become stronger, Roanoa Zoro. You know, we'll have a like fight when you become like more powerful. You ain't dead. I didn't kill you when I could have. And then Luffy was worried about Zoro, and Zoro was like, I won't lose ever again. Is that all right? And Luffy was like, of course. As long as you're still alive, that's what matters most. And then him and Usopp went to Kokoyashi Village, and in Kokoyashi Village, Zoro and Usopp get split up a little bit. Zoro takes down like a whole bunch of fishmen too, and he's like, "Damn!" But he did get caught first. First, he got caught by them, and then Nami let him loose, and then he like took down like a whole bunch of fishmen that were in Kokoyashi, and then Arlong came back there and was like, "What the fuck? Who did this?" And they're like, it was that guy called Zoro. Somebody let him go. And he was like, over there, and he listened to Nojiko talk about Nami and her past, and how Bellamere was their mother, and how Kokoyashi Village used to be a better place until Arlong came, and then he started becoming like a dictator and ruling over them, and making their lives hell. Then Zoro, started following Luffy's orders when he found Nami, and he was like, "Yo, we'll protect you, we'll defend you. You're our friend. We'll go handle this business for you." And they walked up in there, and Zoro fought against Hachi, the octopus. He had 8 sword style or 6 sword style. Um, Hachi was not a fucking threat for Zoro. Zoro was able to like cut him down pretty quick. He broke his swords, and then he used Dragon Twister on him, and he was all. Then Arlong was pissed. He like grabbed Zoro, ripped his chest open, and was like, "How are you still like fucking moving around? You shouldn't even be breathing right now with those type of injuries." And Zoro was like, "Well, I just do what I do. And if I have to fight you too, I will." And Zoro got dismissed because at that point he was like gassed. Zoro was like still not recovered from the fight with Mihawk, and he took down Hachon, but he still was like not there. But then Luffy got out of the water, and he took care of Arlong, and then they all got out of there. Um, Luffy then had his bounty of 30 million, and if I remember correctly, Zoro's was like 16 million. They were the ones with bounties on the crew. They go to Logtown, and in Logtown, Zoro finds 2 blades. And he meets Tashigi, which is a girl that looks like Kuina. And he's like, this girl looks like Kuina. Looks like that bitch from the past that was my friend but died. And he was like in there, and he was looking at swords, and he found one that and the guy was like, this guy must be a guy because he picked out Sandai Katetsu, which is one of the Katetsu blades, one of the better grade swords, right? In One Piece, and Tashiga's running that by him, and then the other guy's like, "Yo, that's a cursed blade and other things. The people who wield that, eventually die." And he's like, "Okay, let's see about that." He threw it up in the air and he showcased that the sword actually liked him. And he's like, "Oh, the sword kind of likes me because I threw the sword up in the air and I left my arm out for when the sword come down to like cut my arm, but it didn't even graze me or anything. So I'll be taking this sword with me." And then he was like, the guy was like, "Okay, well that's cool. Take Yubashiri with you too, which is another sword." And he's like, "All right, cool." So then at this point, he had Wanda Uchimonji, Sandai Katetsu, and Yubashiri with him, and those were gonna stick with him for a little bit. And he took those swords and he left, and he found Luffy, and then he was like, "Okay." He ate with them, but Buggy the Clown then found him, had him on the execution platform. Zoro was fighting against Marine. Luffy was like, "Oh, I don't know, I might die," But then lightning came down and they got away, or they were getting away. Tashigi tried to fight against Zoro, but Zoro was like, "This is like, you ain't, a swordsman. You're just some girl that plays games with the Marines and other things. You ain't better than me. And you play games with your looks. You place deceptive acts on me, so I have to get out of here." And he got out of there with his crew. Luffy, got freed by his father and other things, and then they got to the Grand Line. So they got into the Grand Line. Zoro's with them on, because he's the vice captain, basically. They go inside the lagoon, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, there's an old man here, Crocus." And they're like, "Okay," they do that. Luffy fights against Laboon, and then they leave. They left, they painted on his face, and they were like, "Yo," the Straw Hat Jolly Roger, and they was like, "Yo, we'll be back here, at some point." Then they get to Whiskey Peak, and at Whiskey Peak, they're welcomed by Igaram, and Igaram says, "Cool, drinks for all." Yeah. and they were like, "Okay, cool." And Zoro, he's a drinker type, so he's like, "Okay, this is fun." But like, they were like, "Okay." The drinks are going and other things, right? And then the like party like ends up dying and other things, like all of them do. And then like they're all tired and stuff. But Zoro wakes up and he's like, "Man, I want to see some more drinks." But he comes to find out that that's Baroque works, and they were actually there to like fuck around and like take their shit and kill all pirates that try to like be there. And the whole like place was like a setup, Whiskey Peak. And he was fighting against Baroque Works agents. He was like, "Yo, you guys tried to recruit me back in the day, but you guys don't even let me know who the fucking captain is of you guys, who the boss is. So like, I don't want to fucking work with somebody who's not showing their face to me at all times. That's not right." So he was fighting against all these people. Miss Friday, I believe, she was one. She tried to crush Zoro's skull, but then he pulled a reverse on her and was like, "Girl, you can't be doing shit like that. You better calm down. Don't trash it like that." Um, and he did that, and Zoro, Luffy ended up waking up, and Luffy, from his perspective, it looked as if Zoro was just fighting people like because he got angry or something like that. He's like, "Why are you fighting against these people who gave us food and drink, all this other stuff?" And he's like, "Yo, they were trying to like fuck with us. They were gonna like destroy our shit and kill us while we were asleep." So I was actually defending you, and then Zoro and Luffy were fighting. But as they were fighting, Mr. Five and Miss Valentine, they came there, and then Igaram enlightened Nami and them to like Nefertari, VV, and how she was doing this and infiltrated Baroque works to figure out who Crocodile was and other things, as he was orchestrating a whole coup against the kingdom of Alabasta and her father, King Cobra, and inciting a war, a civil war there. And he's like, "Okay, you guys gotta take care of her and get her to her kingdom so she can like make sure this shit stops." Igaram or Luffy took down Miss Five and and Zoro did too, Miss Valentine's Day, and then they got away. Nikaramen gives them a log pose that Luffy breaks, and then they get out of there. They go to Little Garden. Little Garden, Zoro is like, "Okay, Sanji's like, yo, I bet I can catch a bigger dinosaur than you can, and cook it and other things. No, I can catch a bigger, dinosaur than you, kill it, and then you're gonna cook it after I do it. And they do that, and I think that Zoro was the one who caught the Triceratops. He was like, Triceratops, three swords. Let's go head to head and see. And he cut it down, and then Sanji caught a T Rex, and they were like, they were bitching about, mine's is longer, but has more meat on its bones. They're like trying to see who's, better, who won the competition. Zoro basically won because the dinosaur did have more, meat on its bones, and Luffy likes meat. So he's like, "Hey man, what's the catch?" And he was like, "Yeah." But then after that, they went to Drum Island, and there Zoro was just sitting down, waiting for Luffy and Sanji to get back from Crayon's place. Um, Zoro was just there, and waiting mostly, and then he comes to find out that Chopper joined the crew, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, this Ranger's with us." And he's like, Chopper's like, "Yeah, I'm a crew member now. I'm the doctor." So I was like, all right, that's cool. Now another person I need to protect because our captain says that he's valuable. They get to Alabasta, and then they're there, and they're like, okay, Luffy has left us because Luffy likes to run around and do shit just because he feels like it. But he's with the rest of the crew, and they have to wear disguises because they know that they're being watched by Baroque Works. So they have these disguises on, and they're doing that. So eventually, they get to rain dinners, and rain dinners, and they get trapped. Zoro, Smoker, Tashigi, and Luffy, and all of them. Nami and Usopp. The only one that wasn't caught was Sanji. Crocodile says that he's gonna, incite this war even further and then take over, insert his power and be the Desert King that he's supposed to be and rule over Alabasta. And he's looking for Pluton, one of the ancient weapons as well. And she was like, okay, I don't want that to happen. I'm still going to stop this and everything else. Sanji got there, and he was like, Cookie, I'll let us out of here. And he let him out. And then he was like, Luffy was like, don't, like, leave Smoker there to die. He's still a cool guy. He's just a Marine and other things. And Zoro was like, are you sure? Should we really save this guy? He's going to be on our dicks. And he's like, no, that's all right. Smokey's all right. We can handle that if it comes to that. And he's all right, and saved Smoker's life, and then they got away. And he was like, Luffy's like, get to Alabarna and stop that, civil war. I'm going to try to fight Crocodile, They get there, and then they get to Alabarna on the Supersonic Duck Squadron, I think is what they were called. The little ducks that are running in the desert like Karu. And they get there, and then Zoro has to fight against Mr. One, Dawes Bones. See, Dawes Bones is a guy who has the dice fruit, so he has essentially tough skin. Zoro hasn't cut through metal at this point, and he's like, damn, I have to fight against this guy. He's getting cut to pieces, like, and he's like, now die. Zoro then remembers what his master taught him. He was like, there's swordsmen who can cut nothing, but can also cut through anything, based on how they, use their sword and, the rhythm of all things. They can see it and basically control their sword swings. It's like much deeper than what you think it is. And he was like, Zoro found the Wanda Uchimunji, and he was like, okay, let me do this real quick. And he found the tree branch, and he was like, or the palm tree, and it's just like, he slid his sword, and it didn't cut it. But then he was like, okay, I know what to do now. One sword style Lion Song, and he cut him down. He cut past him, and he was like, thanks to you, now I know how to cut through steel. And he defeated Dawes Bones, and that's Zoro becoming stronger and other things. But they got out of there after that whole fiasco with Crocodile. Luffy defeated Crocodile, and then they had new bounties on the head. Zoro's bounty was then 30 million, I believe. Oh, no. It was 60 million. My bad. 60 million for Zoro. And Luffy was 100 million. They get to Mocktown. Nico Robin's now part of the crew. They get to Mocktown and they're talking about finding Sky Island. And Bellamy hears about it and says, "What? You guys are cracked out. That place don't exist." And he starts, you know, beating up Luffy. And Zoro's like, "I'll kill you for fucking with my captain." But then Luffy's like, "No, no, 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 no. Don't do anything." And then they let things happen to him. They let Bellamy beat them up, basically. And, they were like, and Nami's like, "Why'd you let that happen to you guys?" And then they got out of there. Then, they get some things together. Luffy defeats Bellamy and they get up to the Sky Island. And then in Sky Island, they're running around. Enel then, because he's the god of Skypiea, he's like, I can, take down the Shandorians, the Blue Sea Monkeys, and the Skypeans, and like all of that, because I'm a god. These people can't do shit to me. Zoro's in the jungle and shit, and he's fighting against Ohm, which is one of his priests. And he's like, he had to defend Chopper because Chopper was gonna get cut down by him. And he's like, took down Ohm, and then he was one of the four that was left. It was him, Nico Robin, Wiper, and Gonfa. And they were like, we have to take this guy down. And Zoro was, hitting off, 180 caliber Phoenix and some other moves on him. However, at this point, Zoro's hockey is not that good. So, Anaru was able to, take him out along with the other three. And then Zoro was just there, he's like, okay, now Luffy has to handle this guy, apparently, because rubber isn't affected by lightning. And, Luffy took care of that business. They then leave Skypiea and come down. But when they come down, they're met with another challenge in the Marines. Aokiji shows up. And they're like, Nikarame's like, don't fight this guy. He's an admiral, one of the three admirals from Navy HQ. And they're like, we still have to defend you and other stuff. He froze Robin, and they were like, Zoro and Sandy tried to touch him, but then, Zoro's arm got frostbite, basically. Almost got frostbite. But then they were like, and Chopper was like, put it underwater and stuff, so you can get that ice off you and other things. So that happened, and then they got out of there because Luffy got lucky and Aokiji didn't kill him. They get to Water 7, and then Zoro's sleeping on the ship, and Kaku comes there and he says, my captain told you, or your captain, Luffy told me to come here and inspect this ship, but guess what? You guys can't be riding on this shit no more. And he says, what? What are you talking about? And he said, yeah, man, you can't be riding on the ship no more. It's not saleable no more. You guys got to get a new ship. And he was like, well, that's crazy and shit, but, if you're saying it, I guess. And later that night, well, after, they go to the Frankie family and kick their ass because they beat up Usopp, they start fighting about Luffy and Usopp start fighting about the ship situation. Kaya gave us that ship. This is important ship. We have memories here. Luffy's like, that might be true, but we have to continue our journey. That's what this is all about. And you don't steer where this crew goes. That's my fucking job. I'm the captain, and you have to eat calls for me. And then Usopp, they were like, we're gonna fight. Zoro's like, okay, if they want to do that, they'll do that. And then Luffy ended up beating Usopp. And he's like, basically, Luffy was sad because he lost a crew member, but Zoro's like, being captain, you make hard decisions and shit. So we have to keep on doing what we do as a crew, and we have to figure out what's going on with Robin, because at that point, Robin was taken by CP9 and other things. And Zoro was there. He went to Galley Law Firm, and he found out that Kaku and all these people were part of CP9, and they were like, on Iceberg's dick trying to kill him. And they were like, okay, but then they took Robin and also Frankie Cunning Flam, and they've taken him to the Tower of Law and her, so they could get executed. To Enies Lobby, then they would go through the gates and then get taken to Marineford and get their heads chopped off. But the crew got there. They got on the sea train. Zoro on the sea train, he was fighting against Captain T-Bone, a Navy captain. And he was like, having some problems with him a little bit, but then he cut through him like, boom. And T-Bone got, destroyed by Zoro. Then once they get to Annie's lobby, they fight past these fucking scrubs, and then they're like, standing there, and Luffy tells Robin, do you want to live? And then she was like, I want to live. And then they were all like, okay, we knew she wanted to. She was just trying to like protect us and shit, but we'll like get our crew member back. So they start running around, and then Zoro end up finding Kaku. Usopp's like linked to him, and he's like, I can't fight um, Kaku and Jabra with you linked to me. This is too hard. But then they get unlinked, and then Sanji fights Jabra, and then Zoro starts fighting against Kaku. And like during this fight, Zoro gets another like power boost basically. And he's like fighting with his three sword style. And this guy, Kaku, has four sword style, the six powers techniques, and the power of a giraffe. And he enlightens Zoro to that. And Zoro's like, you might have all that shit, right? But I have three sword style. And I'm gonna beat you with that. Zoro awakens nine sword demon aura, um, Ashura, Silver Mist, and he takes him down. But also, when Luffy's fighting against Lucci, he's fighting against the guy who uses the Rust fruit, and Yubashiri is like, then no more. It rusts away and other things, so then Zoro only has two swords. But they get out of there because Luffy ends up defeating Rob Lucci, and then they have new bounties. Zoro's is 120 million at that point, and they get on their way to, and with the help of Frankie, they have a new ship called the Sunny. They get to Thriller Bark, and on Thriller Bark, they're trying to help a skeleton named Brook, and Brook's like, yo, I need my shadow back. If you guys get your shadows taken, and when the sun comes up, you guys will disintegrate, become nothing but dust. He's like, okay, we'll find this guy's shadow and stuff. So Brook starts fighting against a guy named Ryuma, who is a corpse of the like basically the strongest swordsman that there ever was in One Piece, Shimutsuki Ryuma. And he said yes, fighting against him Brook was, and then Zoro had to step in and help him because Brook couldn't handle that shit. He was like, I'll take this guy on, and he started fighting against him, and he was like, that sword looks cool. That's a black blade truthfully, a legendary sword and shit. And it's like a sacred treasure and shit, as you find out later. A national treasure, I mean, too. And then Zoro is fighting against him, and he ends up taking him down. And then he's like, the sword belongs to you now, and that's Black Blade Truthfully, and he had it. And then Zoro helps Luffy take on uh, Oars, and he tries to help take on Moria and other things. And then another warlord appears after Moria is defeated, Bartholomew Kuma, and all of them are taken down by the Ursa Shock except him and Sanji. And then he's like, Kuma's like, I have been ordered to take your captain, and he's been causing a lot of havoc and shit. And the world government has taken note of that. And Zoro's like, take me instead. He knocks Sanji out and says, take me instead because I am going to be a threat. I want to be the strongest swordsman in the world, but I am the vice captain, and I don't need my captain being fucked with. Take me in instead. And he's like, okay, whatever. And then Kuma's like, here, take all this. He pushes all the pain that Luffy like endured during the fight with Moria and Oars, and he takes it out. It's a big ass red bubble that has a lot of pain in it, like all kind of shit. And he's like, here, have a taste. And Zoro's like, and before that, he was trying to fight against Kuma, but Kuma's just he's a different breed at this point. And he takes a little bit of that pain, and he's like, it fucks him up bad, and he's like, man, I can take all of this. And then he's like, you'll surely die, is what Kuma said. The next day, Sanji wakes up and he's like, oh shit, where's Moss at? They go and he finds him, and he's like, yo, what the hell is all this blood everywhere? Zoro's just like, the Sanji's like, what happened? And he's like, nothing happened. And then it was just the next episode. They get to Sabaody Archipelago, and they've come to find that Luffy and Zoro are one of the 7 supernovas, or 11 supernovas. My bad, 11 supernovas. So rookie pirates who have bounties over 100 million, and they're like all on the island and shit. And on this island, Zoro gets a little bit lost because he doesn't know directions and shit. And he has alcohol. He's trying to find some more, and he's like, yo, you know where I can find booze? He walks up on St. Charles, and these people are bowing and shit because they know who St. Charles is. St. Charles is one of the celestial dragons. If they don't bow to celestial dragons, he could like have them executed. He could all kind of shit, because people he calls to them. Um, they have like escorts from like cypher agents of weak ass cypher agents and other things. Zoro's like, are you serious? You ain't gonna give me some? And then St. Charles gets scared and he's like, he pulls the gun out on Zoro and he's like, and he was gonna cut down St. Charles, but then Bonnie jumps in the way and he's like, oh my gosh, my big brother, you killed him and other stuff. And then Zoro's like, what are you doing? And she's like, yo, you can't be doing shit like that. That's a celestial dragon. You can't just walk up on him and try to like cut him down when he pulls a gun on you. And he's like, but he was gonna try to kill me. I'm doing I'm defending myself, girl. What the fuck? And then Luffy finds him and he's like, yo, we gotta save Kami. Because Kami was a mermaid that they had met, Hachan's friend, and they were gonna sell her off at the auction. They get to the auction and they're like there and they're watching all this shit go down. Um, Hachan gets shot and then Luffy punches St. Charles and then the Admiral Kizaru gets sent on him. But on the way, Rayleigh comes there and knocks people out. And then they go to Rayleigh's place and he enlightens them to, he's the vice captain of Gold Roger Pirates, and he knew about the One Piece and where it's at and everything else. But Luffy's like, we don't need to know too much. It's glad that we met you and other things, but we need to get on our journey. And he's like, okay, cool. But then along the way, this is when the tragedy happens where they get separated and other things. Zoro is still not recovered from the fight with Kuma and shit, and he's like on like he's weaker than like even Sanji. And Sanji's like, Ma said, what the fuck are you doing? You're kind of like not there. And he's like, nah, I'm still here. I'm still fighting and other things. But they're fighting against a pacifista. Like the whole crew's fighting against one pacifista, a model of like Kuma. Um, and they ended up taking it down almost. But then the real Kuma showed up. And Kizaru was gonna kill Zoro too, and then Rayleigh comes to save him, fights against Kizaru, and then Zoro's the first one to get sent away. But when Zoro gets sent away, he gets sent to Mihawk's Island. He comes to find that out later and shit. He's fighting against these monkeys and shit, and then all of a sudden Mihawk appears after the War of the Best, and he's like, I saw your captain at Marineford. He tried to save his brother, but he came up short, you know. And you're still here. And he's like, yes, I need to become stronger. Luffy left a message, 3D X'd out and 2Y on his like shoulder. And that was a message to his crew that we ain't gonna meet in Sabaody in 3 days, but in 2 years. So we have to train and get stronger for that time period. And in that time, Zoro like learned from Mihawk, better hockey, um, armament and observation, but mostly armament hockey. And he was the first one to Sabaody after the time skip, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm here," and other things. He was waiting at Shockey's bar, and they were like, "Okay," and he got there. The whole crew assembles again. Luffy, stunts on some pacifistas, and then they get to Fishman Island. And in Fishman Island, Zoro also showcases his power a little bit. He fights against Horty Jones, the guy that Luffy would then fight, because they were playing games with the royal family, King Neptune, and trying to like take over his like throne, and then have basically an uprising of these fishmen coming to the surface to take over, humanity, but even more like extreme than Arlong. And he was like, you know what, I can fight against you even in the water. And he cut Horty Jones good, but then he took steroids, and when he takes steroids, then Zero was like, oh fuck, and I'm in the water. So he lost that, and they got caged up. But then they got out, and they met. All of them met somewhere in Fisherman Island, and there was 50,000 fishermen. And Luffy was like, "Don't worry, I can handle this shit." He like knocked them all out with Conqueror's Haki, and then they were fighting against the new Fishman pirates. Zoro fighting against this guy who was a drunk and also took steroids because he's part of Horty Jones' crew. And he was like, "Okay, fine." We'll run that shit real quick. And Zoro was like, he was playing games. He was like, not going all out. But then the guy like almost cut him like real good, and he was like, okay, now let me like not play games anymore. And he cut his arms off and cut him down, and he was like, that guy was all fucked up. That guy loved to kill people too. And after that, Luffy fought against Horty Jones and got out of there. Um, Jinbei gave him some blood and was like, now we're on to the next half of the Grand Line, and Punk Hazard was there. They get Zoro disembarks on the ship with Luffy. Punk Hazard's half hot, half cold because of a duel with Akahinu and Aokiji on that island that spun 10 days, and they like reshaped the island. Weather conditions did shit to them. Did shit to the island, and then they are there and they find a dragon. And Luffy's like, let me fight this dragon real quick, and he's like, okay, sure. But then Luffy's like, I can't, do certain things, and Zoro's like, all right, whatever, I'm gonna cut this dragon's head off, and he did. Then they meet a head or a torso. I'm trying to remember. It was a head and torso, a Kinemon, and he said, I'm looking for my son Momonosuke. He's somewhere on the island. You help me find him, and they were like, okay, we'll help you find him, and other stuff. Zoro's then running around with the rest of the crew, and they get their like the rest of the crew gets their body switched out with one another by Trafalgar Law, and then they find these kids who are being drugged by um, Caesar Clown. He's feeding them drugs to play a game. He likes to fuck around with these kids, and they're like, this ain't cool, and we need to kill that guy. He deserves the death penalty and all kind of shit. Then because the Marines are there too, G5 unit, which is led by Smoker. Um, Virgo and is there, and he's he calls the Doflamingo. Zoro is fighting against Monet at that point, and Tashigi tries to help him out, but Tashigi's not like Zoro. He's like, okay, I'll help, and you guys, nah, me and her get the kids out of there, and I'll fight against this woman. And he cut her down with some observation. Like, she was playing games with like snow cone, um, and he cut her down, cut her in half, cut her like arm off and like her wing. She was like, oh fuck, she was like almost dead. But then Luffy took down Caesar, Law took down Virgo, and they got out of there. They went to Dressrosa, and in Dressrosa, Zoro wears a disguise, and the Totata tries to take his sword, and he's like, oh shit, I have to get my sword back. He gets his sword back, and eventually they see Traffy on the ground dead, almost, because Doflamingo shooting him full of holes. And then Zoro's like, trying to go defend Traffy, and then Fujitora steps in the way. Fujitora is a swordsman too, but he's, I ain't gonna say he has better sword skills than Zoro, but his devil fruit power is a problem. And he puts Zoro in the ground with gravity. And then after that happens, Luffy is looking for Doflamingo, and Pika is a problem. So Zoro steps up to the plate and says, okay, go find Doflamingo, I'll fight this guy. And that is one of Doflamingo's, guys. He's caused the card number, or not number, but the suit of clubs. And Pika's like, you know, you can't find my real body. I'm a big this and that. I use the stone fruit. Most people can't take me down. Da, 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 da. He has a like squeaky voice, and Zoro's like, "Oh my god, I have to fight against this guy." And he's trying to find his real body because like he's like a big stone like figure, right? Giant and everything, but like his real body's like a regular sized body, really, kind of. And he's trying to like cut through and see him. He's trying to find him with observation hockey and other things. He's cutting him, but he's having a hard time finding it. But then Zoro gets eventually gets thrown by Columbus. And he uses three sword style hockey coated blades to cut him down. And he falls down and other things. And then Zoro's like, cool. Now we just gotta wait for Luffy to stop this birdcage. And then he's like trying to stop the birdcage from like destroying Dressrosa with everybody else. Um, encoding swords in hockey and trying to like hold that shit back from like, cause like the cage is like closing in like this, but as it closes in, it's like destroying it. Cause like these strings that Doflamingo has are like not just any type of strings. These are powerful, um, thick. They can cut through steel and other things. These strings can. And he's like, damn, and Zoro, is there at the end of it all, and they're like, we have to get off this island. They get off that island, they get to Zoe, and they find out that Sandy's taken, somewhere else. He went to go marry Pudding and other things, and he was like, I knew that Cook was like not trustworthy, but you like him and other things. I'll go to Wano with um, Nico Robin and Topper and Frankie and Brooke, and then Traffy. We'll find his crew there, and then we'll meet you, there after you get the cook, And he was like, okay. Zoro's on the island. He's drinking sake and just enjoying himself because I don't know. To me, it looked like Zoro was like at home almost because, like I said, he's from Shimotsuki Village in Shimotsuki, Ryuma, and the sword that he carries is a national treasure of Wano, is what he finds out. See, he's friends for cutting somebody down and other things, and they're like, okay, here, you're the slasher and stuff that's been running around cutting people up. And he's like, whatever, and they're like, you need to commit seppuku right here in front of us because you have done, greatly evil deeds. You stole this treasure from Wano. I don't know how it got in your hands, but you have to die. We'll be taking this blade off your hands and other things. And he says, whatever, he grabs the little knife that they tried to tell him to kill himself with, and he coats it in hockey and cuts him down. And then he takes down everybody there. And he gets away, and he's running around still for a while. Hiyori finds him and is like, okay, but that's after he fights against Killer. See, Killer eats a smile fruit, and he goes around as a guy called the Slasher too, and he's like, okay, yeah, let's run that shit real quick. Um, Killer is actually one of the supernova as well. He has bounty that's like pretty substantial as shit. At this point, the bounty is 320 million, and he's fighting against him. And he's like, but he gets stabbed by one of the sides that he has, and he's like, oh my god, are you fucking serious? He grabs it because he didn't. He was down one sword because they had took their shoe sweep from him, and he that fight was good animation. Zoro versus Killer, and he cut him down, but he had blood loss and other things, and Hiyori was like she fell in love with Zoro, and she spent some time with him, and he spent some time with her, but it wasn't like that. He was just trying to get some healed up for a time, and Otama, not Otama, the other girl, um Yosui's daughter, and who ate a small fruit, and she's always smiling like. Then they're there, and they meet all the nine shadows, basically the nine scabbards, the Akazaya nine, um, Odin's retainers, and they're like, we have to, you know, attack Onigashima in a couple of days and take over, reclaim this country, and insert, Momonosuke as the Shogun of Wano, because that's what our duty is, and that's what Toki like foretold in the vision. It take 20 years under a certain moon and other things that things would become free in Wano, and Zoro was happy to help them out, but Sukiyaki, or a guy who was um, given he gave Zoro Enma, and he was like, we can't let you have that sword, but you can have this sword. This is the sword that cut down Kaido, or it didn't cut him down, but it marked him. Kaido was a tank and shit, and it was like, this sword is like, it has power and shit. And CMO was a special sword. It loved being held by Odin, so like some of that was still in the sword, and like you could tell that Zoro wasn't its true owner, and Zoro was having a problem getting control of it, and he like was trying to like practice with it and other things. Then they go and attack Onigashima, and there Zoro then showcases feats of conqueror's hockey. He takes down some like goons, Kaido goons with some conquer hockey. Then he's fighting on the performance floor. Um, Apu's there and he's playing games with plague bullets because he's on the side of Kaido. 'Cause he's a little bitch and he didn't want to help other people out. So Zoro is like, he has the antidote, and Zoro runs up on him with the one sword style, cuts him down, gets the antidote to Chopper. But then he's like, I have to get on the rooftop and help Luffy out fight against Kaido and Big Mom because they were up there. So him, Luffy, and Law Kid and Killer were there, and they were fighting on the rooftop. Out of everybody on the rooftop, Zoro showcased the best moves. When it was them five up there, he cut Big Mom off the roof, and she fell into the water for a little bit. Prometheus saved her. And then he went into nine sword style, Demon Ashura for him, and using Conquer Hockey too, and cut Kaido. He scarred Kaido a little bit, and he was like, but it still wasn't enough. He like went all out to just do that, because Kaido is a fucking tank, y'all. He's a real problem. Um, and Zoro passes out, and then Law's like, okay, let's take him down to get healed by the doctor. And they wrap him up, and then Sanji takes him to Chopper. Chopper's working on getting an antidote made for everybody else who has been shot with plague bullets, and Zoro's there, and then he gives him basically treatment basically, but it ain't like a true treatment. It basically gives him the power to like stand up on his own 2 feet and other things and not feel pain for a time. And Zoro gets out and he's like, okay, this is cool. Now I can like fight against, the enemy, King and Queen. And he start fighting against King. King is a Lemurian that has black wings and a flame on his back. See, Zoro had to figure out some shit about King. King is like the right hand man of Kaido. And he was having problems with controlling Emma during that fight. He almost lost his swords completely, but he found his swords again and he was fighting against King. And eventually, he found out that when the flame goes out, that's when he can attack and actually deal damage to King. And he cut his mask off and he found that he was a guy with dark skin and light hair, Lunarian. And he was like, okay, I have to defeat you. He's fighting. He uses Dragon Damnation and then he cuts him down. And he becomes known as the King of Hell Zoro because of the Enma. And he was able to, essentially, but he didn't fully master Enma. He cut down King though, and King was like, done. Um, Zoro was like gassed because like he still wasn't fully recovered. It was just a little, treatment that Chopper gave him. And he saw the Grim Reaper in his dreams. And he was like, oh shit, I can't die yet. I should ought to become the strongest swordsman. And he was all right though. They freed Wano because Luffy, defeated Kaido, and then they were in the hot springs and other things, chilling, and they got their new bounties, 1.1 billion 100 and 11 million for Zoro. So 1.111 billion berries for Zoro. Finally hitting the billion berry mark for himself. And his captain Luffy had 3 billion berries on his head. And then he was also recognized as Yonko, one of the 4 emperors of the sea at that point. They're like, we're going to go to this way or that way. They each had poneglyphs and shit. Law, Kid, and Luffy, and they're on their own captains and shit. So they're like, okay, we'll draw lots and we'll each go a different way. We ain't going to go the same way. Because we have different crews and it's like a race to the One Piece. And so they went their different ways. Zoro's, there, and now they get to Egghead. And in Egghead, they have to fight against Seraphim, and Vegapunk is getting hunted down by the government. Um, Zoro stops Kaku because Kaku's weak as fuck at this point. Zero's like, this ain't any lobby boy. Like I can like stop your shit easy. Uh, and he's there and he's just holding down and defending Vegapunk from the government because they were coming there to kill him. But I only talk about the anime from here. But is Zoro gonna become the strongest swordsman, or is he gonna die before he gets there? Is he gonna, blacken one of his blades and turn it permanently black? That's some questions that some, anime heads have, especially if they watch One Piece. I think that Zoro is gonna do that. Um, I don't think he's gonna die at the end of One Piece or anything. He'll be like alive to tell the stories and other shit. And yeah, just stay tuned and watch One Piece when it comes back next month. And stay cool on the corner because this was the story of Roronoa Zoro as told by the Green Angel. But stay cool on the corner.